Welcome everyone to German Tool Reviews. Today we have a showdown of a couple of pivoting joint side cutters. What I'm calling a pivoting joint side cutter is one that uses a movable joint to provide additional leverage and thereby can cut higher capacity material with a shorter length handle. So let's take a look at the candidates for this showdown. First up we have the Wiha 32636. This unit is made in Vietnam and has the distinct feature whereby the pivoting joint feature can be turned on and off via the power button. It is offered with either the plastic-coated or two-component comfort grip handles. Then we have the NWS 138-69-200. This unit is made in Germany and comes with a black Teflon finish. You can also get this with a chrome finish with other handle styles and in several other lengths as well. Then we have the Knipex 7372-180. This unit has been branded Twin Force and has a pivoting joint that is much more perpendicular to the cutter jaws than any of the other units. This unit is offered with either the plastic-coated or two-component handles. It is only offered in one length at 180 millimeters. So let's get into a breakdown of each of the categories I'm scoring the units on. First up we have price at 10%, where of course lower is better. Then we have jaw opening width at 15%, where wider is better. Then we have the jaw to handle width ratio, which I'll get into a little bit later, at 15%, where smaller is better. Then we got build quality at 10%, which is overall observations on workmanship. Then cutting performance at 30%, how much relative force does it take to get through each of the materials. And finally blade longevity at 20%, how are the blades holding up after some use. Before we get into the actual showdown, I want to point out a couple of things on the Wiha unit that seem a bit misleading. There are three separate claims that I could garner from just the packaging on the unit. We have 40% less force, 40% less effort, 50% less hand strength required, and bi-cut 200% power. The 50% and 200% values I can see since these are reciprocal depending on if you're looking at an increasing or decreasing value. But I am confused with the 40 and 50% claims since there is only the application of a single force when using pliers. It appears to say the same thing but with two separate values given. I set up my own little experiment by testing how much force it takes to get through this mild steel wire using a force gauge. I took 3 readings without the power button pushed in and got an average of 16.94 pounds of force. Then I took 3 more readings with the power button engaged and got an average of 8.74 pounds. Using the percent change calculation, this results in a 48.4% decrease in force required, which is right about on that 50% number that they have documented. So the claims are valid, but it probably would be better to take one of these two values out of the advertising to avoid such confusion. Using the list price of each unit, I normalized them to give a score between 1 and 10, with 10 being the lowest price unit. The lowest price unit was the Wiha, with the NWS a fairly close second. The Kennebec, on the other hand, was way higher than the others. You could literally buy 3 Wiha units for the price of 1 Knipex unit. Again, these are list prices, so you'll be able to find these at significant discounts depending on the distributor. Because these pliers use a pivoting joint, they become very limited in the capacity of material they can cut due to the reduced jaw opening. Measuring the jaw opening on each of the units, the NWS came out on top at 12 millimeters, while the Wiha and Knipex units both measured 10 millimeters. It's important to note that the jaw opening on the Wiha unit goes to 27 millimeters when not in the power mode. With this larger opening, you're sacrificing the mechanical advantage that you get with the pivoting joint and thereby making it harder to cut the material. A disadvantage of this style cutter is that you need to open the handles extremely wide to get the jaws sufficiently open. However, I have noticed that each of these opens a bit differently, making the ratios of the handles to jaw widths different. My preference is to have a smaller ratio, meaning you can actually start the cut with one hand. After measuring the maximum handle opening width, I got ratio values of 17.5 to 1 for the Wiha, 15 to 1 for the NWS, and 11.5 to 1 for the Knipex. This normalizes out to a 10 for the Knipex, a 7.67 for the NWS, and a 6.57 for the Wiha. Now into the design and quality scoring, a very subjective category whereby my opinions may not exactly match everyone else's. First, looking at the Wiha unit, the design seemed pretty solid with a nice job done on the handles and around the jaw area. The power button can be a bit finicky at times, so you have to have the jaw in a specific position in order to switch between power and non-power modes. I noticed there appeared to be a splash of some sort of adhesive or lacquer on the surface near the power button. I was able to scrape it off, but usually when you see stuff like this, it is because a stringent quality assurance program has not been implemented or followed. The other thing I usually check for in pliers is to see how true their surface grinding machines are by checking for any gaps or changes in elevation between the surface and the joint. As you can see here, there is a noticeable ridge when you open the pliers, which indicates that either the jig holding the pliers or the surface grinder itself was not leveled during this operation. Overall, pretty solid design and build, but for the few issues I mentioned, I've given the Wiha an 8 in this category. The NWS unit has its familiar black Teflon finish for this particular unit, It also has the recognizable comfort grip handles that are really like no other in the market at the moment. As I mentioned before about the trueness of the surface joint, the NWS has no such gap, which is an indicator they're using better calibrated grinders in the Wiha. One interesting thing about the NWS design is how far the pivoting joint portion is from the actual jaws compared to the other units. I suppose this gives them a bit more leverage in most circumstances. I went over these pliers pretty thoroughly and did not see any issues or things I didn't like about them, so for this reason I gave the NWS a 10. Next up is the Knipex Twin Force unit. These actually came with instructions, which I believe are the first pliers I've ever bought that included instructions. These directions are much more useful than you would expect, which I'll get into a bit. The Knipex unit is unique in that it uses an unusual oblong shape for the travel of the pivoting portion, which is visible from both sides of the pliers. I looked over them and really didn't see any surface defects or other manufacturing issues. One issue I saw is that the joints were extremely stiff on this unit out of the box. Even after oiling them, they were still quite hard to open. This may be by design, but not necessarily desirable. For this one issue, I gave the Knipex a 9. For the testing of the cutting force required, I used some mild steel wire with the pliers in a vise, and then a force gauge to measure how much force it takes to get through the wire. I did this 3 times for each unit and then averaged them. The best unit in terms of cutting force required out of the 3 was the NWS, which required an average of 8.05 pounds of force. The Wiha was close behind with a force of 8.74 pounds in power mode. The Knipex came out with the highest amount of force required at 10.32 pounds. Normalizing these scores, you get the NWS at 10, the Wiha at 9.21, and the Knipex at 7.8. On to some more extreme testing. All 3 of these units are specifically advertised with the ability to cut 3mm piano wire. Piano wire is also known as music wire and is a tempered high carbon spring steel. I went ahead and bought some 2.5mm wire, which is below the capacity of this unit, but as you will see, it still was a challenge to get through this. The instructions included with the Knipex were quite relevant to cutting this very hard wire. Instead of cutting it on one try, you need to cut it with several attempts, moving it closer to the pivot point on each attempt until you get through it. This set of directions was the case for all 3 units. So if you're cutting very hard material with these pliers, don't get discouraged if you can't cut it through on the first try, as you need to work it towards the pivot point until you get through it. My general observations was that it was much easier to get through the material with the Wiha and the NWS units than the Knipex. I made about half a dozen cuts of this size spring wire with each pair of pliers. One thing I noticed after cutting the hardened music wire is the effect it had on the jaws on each of the units. When you squeeze close the jaws, you should ideally not be able to see any light coming through the jaws. If you take a close look at the Wiha unit, you can clearly see some deformation on the edges of the jaws. This was by far the worst of the 3 units. Taking a look at the NWS unit, you can see there was a little bit of deformation, but only about half as bad as what happened to the Wiha. On the Knipex, you can definitely tell it fared a bit better, as you can barely see any gap after cutting through the music wire. It knocked off some of the black oxide coating, but other than that, you can barely tell the Knipex was even used. What I think is going on here is sort of what you see with any blade that gets dulled with small bent over edges. I could say that the Wiha and NWS units felt a bit sharper than the Knipex unit, just by rubbing the edges with the tip of a finger. My theory is that the Knipex must use more of a blunt point and thereby doesn't suffer from the same dulling phenomenon when you are using it to cut very hard materials. The trade-off here is that the blunt face cutting jaw will take a bit more force to get through everything. To score this category, I gave the Knipex a 10, I gave the NWS a 7, and the Wiha a 6. If we total the scores using the previously mentioned criteria, we can now rank the candidates using 2 significant digits. They actually all scored relatively close, within 1 point. In first place was the NWS unit with a score of 8.79. The NWS unit, reasonably priced, performed the best in the cutting performance test and had the largest capacity out of all the 3. I do have a couple of small concerns about the longevity of the cutting blade with respect to cutting hard material, but other than that, I really didn't see anything I didn't like about the unit. In second place was the Knipex unit with a score of 8.31. The blades on the Knipex seem to fare the best against the hardened music wire. It also has a good capacity to handle width ratio and build quality. The cons were clearly the price of the unit, which was more than double the closest competitor, and that it took a bit more effort to get through some of the material. In third place with a score of 8.00 is the Wiha unit. The pros of the Wiha unit was that it was the cheapest of the 3 and had pretty good cutting performance. The issues I see with it are the longevity issues with the cutting jaws when using it with hardened materials and a couple of suspect build quality issues. However, overall it's still a pretty solid unit. To wrap things up, my recommendation if you had to pick up only one of these 3 would be the NWS. The Knipex would be a good pickup if you plan to use this for hardened wire and materials, as it seems it would outlast any of the other units for this purpose. However, the cost of the Knipex unit would be prohibitively expensive to most people, considering you could buy about 3 Wiha units for the price of 1 Knipex unit. Therefore, from a pure value standpoint, the Wiha unit is also a good buy if you need something that you're not necessarily using for hardened materials all the time. Well, hopefully you enjoyed that showdown of some pivoting joint side cutters. Check out the link in the description of the 4 review. There are also some affiliate links in the description if you feel the urge to pick any of these up. Have a good week, and I'll catch you guys next time.